It's officially been half a century since Steven Spielberg's Jaws first opened and changed the world of film forever. With its terrifying tale of a rogue shark terrorizing the small community of Amity Island and the people determined to stop it, Jaws became the first film to truly define what a blockbuster could be, mixing horror with adventure and some unforgettable characters to captivate audiences. Outside of its mark on film history, I truly think it's one of the greatest movies of all time, the result of a remarkable group of people coming together to make something that captures what movie magic is all about. And after its success, Universal Pictures tried to recapture lightning in a bottle with 3 sequels that range from the disappointing to the unintentionally hilarious. But they, and a whole lot of Jaws ripoffs, illustrate the one-of-a-kind nature of the film that launched the career of Steven Spielberg and the summer blockbuster. And in its wake, both horror and the ecological well-being of sharks in the real world have never been the same. It's time to go back in the water and explore 50 years of Jaws. Jaws is one of the most successful movies of all time. It's not hyperbole to say that it changed what people and studios thought that a film could do, but the secret to its success is that it's a blockbuster built on a blockbuster, with Peter Benchley's original novel being a massive bestseller just a year before. Benchley held a lifelong fascination with sharks, and building on shark encounters while fishing as a young boy and real-life stories of shark attacks, the author sold a book pitch to Doubleday Publishing and editor Thomas Congdon about a beach resort terrorized by a shark. And after several revisions that changed the book from comedic to serious, and adding in much more research done by Benchley, the novel was published in February 1974, with the title eventually settled on as Jaws by Congdon, when nothing else could be agreed upon, and the now iconic cover illustrated by Roger Castle, and eventually reused for the film's poster. And Jaws was an instant success on release, selling 125,000 copies in its first year, and staying on the New York Times bestseller list for 44 weeks. It's the type of instant success that made the rest of Benchley's career, even without a film adaptation. And Jaws, the novel, is the type of beach read thriller that's easy for mass consumption. More adult and darker than you may expect, but, in my opinion, pretty bad, save for a few bright spots. Even if you've never read the book, you know its story because it's so similar to the film. Jaws sees the small northeast coastal town of Amity Island terrorized by the arrival of a great white shark that begins hunting off its coast and refusing to leave, killing a variety of people who come into the ocean. Chief Martin Brody, here a longtime Amity resident, is in charge of figuring out how to stop the attacks, but resistance from Mayor Vaughn, who believes closing the beaches during the summer will financially ruin the town, fights to cover up the story, with more and more people dying from the lack of action. Eventually, Brody, ichthyologist Matt Hooper, and crusty fisherman Quint hunt the shark on the open seas, with more lives lost along the way. Overall, Benchley's novel hits the same beats as the film. The opening shark attack on Chrissy Watkins, the discovery and the mayor's denial of Brody wanting to close the beaches, the arrival of Matt Hooper to investigate the shark, a lot of the same attacks and victims, and the eventual pursuit of the shark on the open ocean with Quint on board the Orca. Of course, this is a nearly 300-page novel turned into a 2-hour movie, so there's going to be things that get cut out. And boy am I glad they did. Jaws, the novel, has a 3-act structure, and for the most part, the shark is entirely absent from its second act. Instead, Benchley's story becomes focused on Brody's contentious relationship with the entire town of Amity, which is only 1,000 people here and who are quickly losing all business due to the attacks. Alongside that, we find out that the town mayor, who is also a major real estate investor, is in too deep with the mob, who are threatening both him and Brody to give them what they want. And finally, Ellen has an affair with Hooper, becoming repulsed by Chief Brody and hating her life, seeing Hooper, who is the younger brother of a man she once dated, as a lifeline to her past. There's just so much here about Ellen's repressed desires and the very awkward sex she eventually has with Hooper, who is described as very young and chiseled and un-Richard Dreyfuss-like. Alongside that is an overall difference that I think makes the book much weaker than the film. I don't like anybody in this story. Chief Brody is a sexually frustrated jerk that covers up most of the shark attacks willingly. Hooper is more than happy to use Ellen for his own pleasure and doesn't really care about anybody on the island. Quint has no deeper personal convictions. The USS Indianapolis backstory is only in the film. Ellen hates her life. The mayor is out for personal gain, and the book, which often dives into the minds of its characters, paints them all as deeply angry, unhappy, and horny. As for the shark itself, being a novel gives Benchley an advantage the film can't replicate. From its opening, the author devotes lengthy passages to following the shark underwater, detailing its hunt, how it intakes the underwater world around it, and how its senses make it an emotionless killing machine. The attacks are also rendered in gruesome detail. The great conical head struck her like a locomotive, knocking her up out of the water. The jaws snapped shut around her torso, crushing bones and flesh and organs into a jelly. The result is that Jaws is a much more brutal, much darker, much more gruesome story than the film, but the shark itself becomes much more of a pure animal in the book. In Spielberg's lens, the shark is still an animal first, but is mysterious and bordering on a monster. It's smarter and more deliberate than the shark of the book, which, while 20 feet long, is shown to be simply acting on instinct, and that larger circumstances that no one can understand have pushed it to hunt around Amity. Later films will make their sharks out to be more and more of monsters, but in Benchley's novel, fear comes from nature simply being more dangerous than we could ever predict. There's also elements here that are shared with the film, but have a very different execution. Martin and Ellen have children, 3 sons, but they hardly play any role. Instead, the Brodies are miserable in their marriage and it only gets worse. The focus of the final act is the hunt for the shark, but the orca only makes day trips out to sea, coming back each night and really disrupting any tension or flow to the hunt. And while it comes down to a face-off between Brody and the shark, it all plays out really differently as Hooper is quickly eaten by the great white when he goes down in the shark cage. And when it wrecks the boat, Quint is tangled in a harpoon rope and dragged underwater to his death. Really, the end is incredibly underwhelming, as the shark dies from its mounting injuries and sinks to the bottom of the ocean with Quint's dead body still strung to it. An Ahab-like watery doom while Brody heads off into an unknown future. The fish came closer. It was only a few feet away, and Brody could see the conical snout. He screamed, an ejaculation of hopelessness, and closed his eyes, waiting for an agony he could not imagine. Nothing happened. He opened his eyes. The fish was nearly touching him, only a foot or two away, but it stopped. And then, as Brody watched, the steel-gray body began to recede downward into the gloom. It seemed to fall away, an apparition evanescing into darkness. No real cathartic ending, no conclusion to the dangling plot threads or Brody's shattered marriage. He just starts to swim back home, technically just like in the movie, but bad. There would be no book sequel to Jaws, but Benchley would go on to write many more novels, mostly around ocean monsters and non-fiction surrounding sharks, with Jaws essentially defining his career. But his blockbuster story would quickly evolve beyond the novel.
It is as if God created the devil and gave him Jaws.
Jaws was essentially bound for the big screen before it was even published, with Universal Pictures producers Richard Zanuck and David Brown purchasing the rights to the novel in 1973 for $175,000. And with the studio searching for the right fit to bring their big dreams to life, the search for the right director was incredibly important. Enter Steven Spielberg. Only 26 when hired, Spielberg was quickly making a name for himself as a director, first in TV with episodes of Night Gallery and then the ABC movie Duel, followed by his first theatrical release, The Sugarland Express. But even before filming began, Spielberg was nervous about the shoot, briefly trying to leave but bound by his contract. Meanwhile, Benchley wrote the first several drafts of the film, which was eventually given an uncredited rewrite by playwright Howard Sackler and then Carl Gottlieb, who made the most extensive changes to the script as he continued to rewrite scenes during filming. Overall, the final script of Jaws is the byproduct of a whole lot of contributors shifting the story during production to accommodate shooting complications and adjusting the tone to get it just right, with added comedic levity and the final explosive death of the shark requested by Spielberg. Smile, you son of a... Quint's USS Indianapolis speech, maybe the most lauded bit of writing and acting in the entire film, and rightfully so, was first added by Sackler, then written as a 10-page monologue by crazed He-Man John Milius, and then refined by Robert Shaw. It's the type of addition that illustrates how much of Jaws' quality is lightning in a bottle, with just the right talent coming together at a moment in time that the 50 years since has proven to be impossible to replicate.
You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes like a doll's eyes.
And of course, we all know that Jaws is the 10th greatest film of all time, ranking just below Evil Dead 2, Predator, Kiki's Delivery Service, Chungking Express, Before Sunset, Shin Gojira, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Rear Window, and Tron Legacy, and right above The Thing. Story-wise, Jaws the film is very much like the novel, with some critical trimmings and additions that add so much. Chief Brody is a recent transplant here, with he and his family moving from New York for a quieter life, and Brody afraid of the water. Hooper and Brody are really compatible souls. Total opposites in life and background, but the camaraderie here is so wonderful. Love these two together. Quint is an obsessive fisherman who survived the bombing and subsequent multi-day real-life shark attack on the USS Indianapolis during World War II, driving him mad and pushing him to hunt our shark till his last breath. And structurally, Spielberg's film is so elegant, beginning with the first attacks, the beach closing forbidden by both the mayor and the townsfolk, who need business for the 4th of July, and an attack on the 4th in front of the public that drives Brody, Hooper, and Quint out to sea, staying out there by choice and then stranded due to Quint's mania for a final confrontation. As Brody, Roy Scheider is giving this incredibly vulnerable and charming performance. There's a weariness to him as essentially the island's sole authority figure, which bounces off the many colorful characters that inhabit Amity and who are given just enough screen time to make this feel like a real, living, breathing community. Love that opening bit of Brody walking across town. And it's Brody's guilt that drives him, with the confrontation by Alex Kintner's mother, and then the wonderfully emotional moment with his own young son afterward, telling you everything you need to know about why Brody does what he does.
Give us a kiss.
Why?
Because I need it.
As his wife Ellen, Lorraine Gary, who was married to Universal head Sid Sheinberg and was the first person cast, I wonder why, has just enough here to illustrate the Brodys as having a very loving, comfortable marriage and family, which I think is infinitely more interesting than a miserable husband and wife. What they do out of love.
Want to get drunk and fool around?
Oh yeah.
As Hooper, Richard Dreyfuss, coming right off of American Graffiti, is bringing a completely different energy. Intelligent, passionate, rich, but compassionate and driven to find the shark. Not for glory, but to keep people safe. Jaws 2 really shows how much this film needs him as a person that gives us insight into the animal. As Quint, Robert Shaw brings an intensity and a sort of Ahab-like obsession, and almost man-out-of-time feeling to the one person in Amity that has any real hope of killing the shark. And as a theatrically trained Englishman, Shaw completely transforms himself into being this intimidating and fascinating New Englander that can't really interface with society. Together, the three are the triumvirate of the film's second half, and how they bounce off each other, connect to each other, and each try to stop the shark is the meaty character work that makes the high seas adventure and bombast have real emotional weight. And then there's the shark. Limited by its constant malfunctions, Spielberg and cinematographer Bill Butler were forced to show the animal as little as possible, with editor Verna Fields cutting together an impeccably timed film that gets its tension, comedy beats, and lingering character moments just right. Seriously, she's the real MVP here. So in lieu of having a terrifying looking shark attacking, we have POV camera shots of swimming feet, quick glimpses of the animal, and the horrifying implication of what's happened. Yes, it's clearly a fake shark, but the finale uses its reveal and unstoppable attacks to really pay off our fears of the shark by the end. We've spent nearly 2 hours in fear of this unseen beast, and now it's here and we can't escape. It's really the result of a patient film that makes every aspect utterly enjoyable on its own. The characters, the small town problems, the dramatic reveals, the attacks, and now we're on this high seas adventure that starts out with joy, turns to terror, and ends with total catharsis. Guys, I just really love Jaws. What a blast to talk about. Jaws is not just one of the most successful movies of all time, its behind-the-scenes stories are almost as famous as the film itself. That's the result of the film's new level of success drawing extra attention, Spielberg's subsequent career keeping the film in the spotlight, screenwriter Carl Gottlieb's official behind-the-scenes book The Jaws Log being published the same year as the film, and many different documentaries being made in conjunction with the film's various anniversaries. So chances are, if you're watching this video, you're pretty familiar with a lot of those stories and anecdotes, and I don't want to waste your time going over the same old stuff. Of course, I also don't want to skip over all the juicy details, so I'm going to give you the anecdotes' greatest hits as quick as possible. The film was mostly shot on location at Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, with a lot of the film's supporting characters actually people that live there.
A what?
Robert Shaw, a man 2/3 composed of alcohol, was too drunk on his first shoot of the Indianapolis speech and begged Spielberg for another day of shooting, which he then nailed. Dreyfuss and Shaw hated each other during filming. Someone not getting along with Dreyfuss during a movie? No way. The majority of the orca scenes out on the ocean really were filmed out on the sea instead of a water tank, and the unpredictability of the ocean made the shoot harder than what anyone expected. Jaws was budgeted at $4 million and ended up costing $9 million to make, while its 55-day shooting schedule ended up actually taking 159 days. John Williams' classic shark theme is mainly composed of two notes, E and F, and Spielberg initially laughed at it. Of course, everybody knows that the mechanical shark used during the film, named Bruce after Spielberg's lawyer, was famously constantly broken, as special effects supervisor Bob Matty had made a complex puppet that worked fine on land, but was immediately destroyed by saltwater. Essentially, every day shooting Jaws was a struggle, with the crew never knowing if or when the shark would work. The result was a benefit to the film in two ways. One, Spielberg had to focus on every other scene not involving the shark to keep the production going, including a lot of unscripted character moments, like Brody and his son copying each other. And it's these very human scenes that make the film shine. They're the stuff I keep coming back for, not the shark attacks. And two, Spielberg was forced to show the shark as little as possible, instead opting for POV attacks, quick glimpses, and fins. The result is that the animal becomes a lurking menace that you can never fully understand or predict. It's those creature from the Black Lagoon-like underwater shots of swimming feet that made people afraid to go in the water, not just the big moments of our shark leaping out at the orca. It's terrifying, but what's funny is how often people debate whether Jaws is a horror movie or not. It totally is. But this is a film that has many, many other aspects to it. Family drama, high seas adventure, comedy, slice of life, and so much more. And when those aspects are in focus, the horror recedes. This means you can really settle in and enjoy those parts of Jaws. And when the horror returns with the shark, accompanied by Williams' score, it's so much scarier. Personally speaking, I've loved Jaws ever since I was a little kid, and I watched it at way too young of an age at my uncle's home. The opening shark attack terrified me, but everything that came afterward simply enthralled me. You'd think that a little boy wouldn't really care about the personal struggles of a middle-aged police chief, but there was something about the way that Spielberg's film did wonders with the life and struggles of Chief Brody and everyone else on the island that I was absolutely invested in this story in between all the high seas adventure and the scary shark attacks. And really, that's the secret to Jaws' success. Spielberg's film makes you absolutely care about each and every one of these characters and builds them up as interesting individuals with their own struggles and their own strengths and weaknesses in between all those big set pieces and scares and the adventure that happens in the final act of the film. And as you'll see later on in the video, every sequel and every copycat has essentially struggled and failed to recapture that very specific magic. And in return, Jaws was a massive success. With a huge marketing campaign behind it, Jaws opened on June 20th, 1975 across 464 screens in the US and Canada, and then slowly expanding more and more in the months to come. The opening weekend was a then record $7 million. But Jaws' success came in the long term, becoming the first ever movie to earn $100 million, spending 14 weeks as the #1 movie in America, and making $133.4 million in its first run. There had never been a success like this in film before, and with the continued re-releases and worldwide openings, Jaws has gone on to make $476.5 million, not counting endless TV airings, rentals, and purchases. The massive success of Jaws helped to fully define the term blockbuster, coming from World War II blockbuster bombs and having been sparingly used to describe some successful films in the decades before. It was a level of immediate success that hadn't been seen in film before that changed the studio approach to wide releases. Universal immediately wanted more.
Now, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, the legend continues.
Making Jaws 2 was not an easy process, and the first major bump in the road was that Spielberg simply refused to return. I've discussed this in other videos, but in his early years as a director, Spielberg was really opposed to making sequels to his films. Obviously, Indiana Jones changed that, but early studio efforts to make another Jaws or Close Encounters were vehemently opposed by the director. In the decades since, Spielberg and those with the Jaws franchise have made a lot of claims about why he refused the sequel, including claiming that Spielberg said sequels were a cheap carny trick, and that he wanted $1 million and a percentage of the profits if he made two. Ultimately, the director said he simply didn't want to make another Jaws when making the first was a nightmare. And while Jaws was a huge success that pushed his career to the next level, I don't blame him. But Spielberg had no real say on whether or not there would end up being a Jaws 2, and producers Brown and Zanuck moved forward without him. Initially, returning writer Howard Sackler proposed basing the film on Quint's story of the USS Indianapolis, which I think could have been an incredible film in the right hands. But this was rejected by Steinberg. Instead, Sackler wrote a much more conventional follow-up, with John D. Hancock, mostly known for theater productions and Let's Scare Jessica to Death, hired to direct. However, shortly after beginning filming, Hancock was fired when he refused to put Steinberg's wife Lorraine Gary as Ellen Brody out on the boat to rescue the teenagers and become the film's hero. Apparently, the term "over my dead body" was used, and out the door he went. With Hancock fired, Jaws 2 was shut down for several weeks, with Jeannot Swark hired as the new director and the script rewritten by a returning Carl Gottlieb. To keep the film moving, Swark had only 1 week to prep the movie and then concentrated on shooting the water skier attack while Gottlieb rewrote the rest. I was in it up to my neck, and I don't think I've ever worked as hard in my entire life, said Swark. The film that resulted is very much a do-over of the first, with the film picking up a few years later, with Chief Brody still keeping Amity Island safe and his sons growing up, but their normal lives are disrupted when a new shark arrives. With Brody determined to save his town and family on his own, with both Quint and Hooper gone and the entire island convinced that his past trauma has made him paranoid. And for all the behind-the-scenes struggle and money spent, apparently as much as $30 million, which would be about $150 million today, Jaws 2 is just a very forgettable movie. Overall, this very much feels like a studio wanting to double down on exactly what made them a lot of money before and hoping to replicate that box office. That includes bringing back John Williams for the score, a lot of the same supporting cast and Amity returning, including Murray Hamilton as Mayor Vaughn, who somehow still has his job, and even trying to reuse the same mechanical sharks used in the first, only to find out they'd rusted and fallen apart while stored in the Universal backlot. These things didn't even work the first time. What are you guys thinking? As for Roy Scheider, the actor was essentially forced to do the movie after dropping out of making The Deer Hunter for Universal. With the actor under contract with the studio, making Jaws 2 was a way to make up for it and not get him in trouble with the company. Everyone else ran, said Scheider. No one wanted to do Jaws 2, but I was contracted to Universal, so I did the second film. But I didn't do 3 and 4 because they got worse and worse and worse and worse, and more embarrassing and more embarrassing. And even though Scheider was making hundreds of thousands more to make Jaws 2, he hated making it, fighting regularly with Swark and resenting the film. Still, Scheider is trying his best here. Really, I think Scheider is an extremely underappreciated actor from the era. His work in not just Jaws, but Sorcerer, The French Connection, and all that jazz really show his range and believability. There's a tension and grit to his performances that add a lot of layers to his characters, no matter the story. Here, he's yelling about another shark and thrashing around a bunch in service to a fairly average script, but he's easily the best thing here. So, how do you make a convincing sequel to a story built all around a complete aberration in nature without it feeling tired and too much of a coincidence? Well, the answer is, you don't. So much of the film is centered around Brody exasperated about how all this is happening again, and nobody believing him that another shark is attacking people. And with Quint dead and Dreyfus unsurprisingly refusing to return, Chief Brody is on his own on the high seas, and given his greatest challenge yet: solo amateur ocean navigation. Stylistically, Jaws 2 is both bigger and smaller than the original. All of the shark attacks are more complex, and the impact is crazier. I mean, you got a lady setting herself and the shark on fire and then blowing up in the first 20 minutes, and the climax involves boats of teens, a helicopter attack, and Brody having to electrocute this fish by hand. But nothing about it feels nearly as grand as the original. Despite Spielberg's film being actually quite personal and all about a small island community, the way the original Jaws moves across set pieces and becomes an adventure gives it this really exciting sweep. Here, everything feels very landlocked, and every ocean scene feels contained to a tank or a harbor. Having constant back and forths between sea and land doesn't help either, and the cast just feels so limited. In a lot of ways, Jaws 2 feels a lot more like a slasher movie despite being released a few months before Carpenter's original Halloween. The shark is more aggressive, the kills are more important than the story, and there is a lot of teen drama. With Brody's kids, Mike and Sean, just so happening to go out on the ocean with their friends and stranded by the shark attacking, forcing Brody once again to fight the Great White one-on-one to save the teens. I wouldn't call Jaws 2 a bad movie, just a very unnecessary one that feels very forgettable because it's essentially the original without the massive talent behind the camera. Still, it's commendable that Swark made the film as well as he did with essentially no prep or script. And although the story here is trying to bring new conflict on the island between the Brodies and the mayor, it lacks the real heart that made the first special. Quality aside, Jaws 2 was a solid hit for Universal, making $77 million on release. Nowhere near the original, but good enough to be the 6th highest grossing film of 1978. The success of the formula, and the many Jaws copies hitting theaters around this time, proved that this could be a dependable series for Universal. But something needed to change for the next installment.
Nature's most terrifying creature takes on an all-new dimension in an all-new adventure. And for the first time, the terror of Jaws will not stop at the edge of the screen.
2 movies about an enormous great white targeting the same family is about as far as you can stretch the bounds of credulity. So when Universal wanted a 3rd movie, producers Brown and Zanuck decided to make the film a spoof called Jaws 3: People Zero. An incredible title, but probably a little too smart for its own good, that would be produced by Animal House's Maddie Simmons and written by National Lampoon writers John Hughes and Todd Carroll. However, once Spielberg heard about the plans to turn the franchise into a comedy, he threatened Universal, saying he'd never work with them again if they made it. This isn't the last time he'd do this either. The E.T. ride is still open at Universal Studios Orlando due to a similar Spielberg threat. And so, Brown and Zanuck were officially out of the franchise. Instead, Jaws 3D was initially written by Richard Matheson, which is absolutely shocking when you realize the author behind I Am Legend, Duel, and a lot of sci-fi classics is behind this piece of crap. But Matheson afterward insisted that his script was both subject to studio demands and heavily rewritten by returning screenwriter Carl Gottlieb and many uncredited script doctors. Directed by Joe Alves, production designer on Jaws, Jaws 2, Close Encounters and Escape from New York, and never directing another movie after this, you'll soon see why, Jaws 3D changes up its story a lot more than any other sequel here, jumping ahead in time and having Michael Brody, played by Dennis Quaid, now working at SeaWorld Orlando as the park's chief engineer, with younger brother Sean visiting, just in time for Leah Thompson to step out of my dreams and into this movie. I mean, another shark problem, which also affects their love interests Kay and Kellyanne, with park manager Calvin and Hunter Fitzroyce looking to profit from it. The reason for the shark attack this time is that the park has lagoon gates that lead to the ocean, only for a great white shark and its baby to enter the park's shared lagoon and begin attacking. None of this seems all that dangerous, so SeaWorld also has some newly opened underwater tunnels for visitors. And when Baby Shark dies in captivity, Mama is out for revenge, putting SeaWorld at risk. Yes, that's right, it's the story of a dangerous predator hunting any creature that enters the ocean. And a great white shark. Boom! Got him! Hit my music! Okay, cut my music. There's just so many things needed for this story to function. Complex, interconnected ocean exhibits, love interests with water-based occupations, a hunter that just so happens to be in the area and spending his free time at SeaWorld, and victim after victim that decide to basically swim right into the shark's stomach. I have absolutely no idea why SeaWorld of all places would want to associate themselves with a franchise all about homicidal sea creatures that need to be killed. In fact, a major plot point comes from the park believing that broadcasting Fitzroy's hunting down and killing the shark within their park live on TV would actually be good for business. I know the 80s were a different time, but that's like Disneyland blowing up Mickey Mouse in the park and expecting to be busier than ever. On top of all this ridiculousness is Universal's decision to film Part 3 as a 3D movie. 3D movies are cyclical. They're like a terrible comic book YouTube channel. You think they've finally given up and then bang, they're right back with another dozen entries that no one really wants to see. And the early 80s saw another big wave of 3D films like Friday the 13th Part 3, Amityville 3D, and this third Jaws entry. Here, the 3D is really only employed at very obvious and big moments, with everything else shot pretty normally and then making a hard shift for the big depth of field change. Behind the scenes, the film had some major issues with trying to get the 3D shots right. At first, Jaws 3D was made with stereo vision, but the production soon switched over to AriVision 3D. Can you believe the 3D was at one time so popular that there were multiple competing companies entirely built on shooting 3D movies? Wild. And the result is a film that takes its biggest moments and slows them down to a crawl, just so they can hit you over the head with the fact that yes, it looks like this absolute piece of shit is coming right at you. I know that the biggest criticism of the original movie is that the shark looks fake, but Spielberg knew how to shoot it just right to get around that. Here, the fakest marine life you ever done seen is shot without cuts as it slowly floats to the screen. Really poorly composited with the rest of the image. Maybe it looked better in the theaters, but decades later, and it's easily the worst looking film in the franchise. Also, according to both Quaid and producer Rupert Hitzig, the set of Jaws 3D was absolutely overflowing with cocaine. Come to think of it, if the original Jaws is taking notes from Creature from the Black Lagoon, then Jaws 3D is lifting wholeheartedly from Revenge of the Creature, complete with a monster that's supposed to be terrifying, trapped and just kind of floating around in an aquarium for all to see in the background. Hey, how's it going? Until it escapes and wreaks havoc. Once again, the shark is blown up. This time with the dead body of Fitzroy somehow stuck in its teeth and holding a grenade that Mike is able to trigger, blowing up the big fish and sending its, very funny movie, Jaws to the screen as our happy couple celebrates with dolphins. Something I've always wanted to do, but maybe not a great way to end your film. It's a really bad movie, but that wouldn't make a difference. Released on July 22nd, 1983, Jaws 3D would make $88 million against its $18 million budget. An actual uptick in profits from the second. By this point, Jaws was Universal's flagship franchise, a modern monster series as synonymous with the studio as Frankenstein, Dracula, or the Wolfman, and the company wouldn't let it go so easily. The result would be one of the most widely ridiculed films of the last half-century.
Man's deepest fear has risen again. Jaws, the Revenge. This time, it's personal.
Yes, it's time to talk about Jaws the Revenge. Released in 1987, Jaws 4 essentially ignores the events of Jaws 3D, and instead has Ellen Brody, a returning Lorraine Gary, now widowed and still living on Amity Island, with younger son Sean working as a sheriff and older son Michael a marine biologist. Well, wouldn't you know it, another shark shows up, quickly killing Sean in what's basically the water-based equivalent of the "'Tis but a scratch" scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Now Ellen is even more devastated, leaving Amity behind and traveling to the Bahamas with Michael's family, striking up a romance with devil-may-care pilot Hoagie, played by Michael Caine, truly showing that he'll take any role for the right price. But wait, there's more. This shark murdered Sean, and is out for revenge against the family of the man who killed its... We're never really fully informed of the shark's family tree, so let's just say, beloved Grunkle, traveling all the way down the coast to attack the Brodies. Oh, and Ellen has some sort of psychic connection with the shark, seeing through its eyes and sensing when it's near. It's a movie that starts as a grim, melodramatic mourning over a family taken too soon, and soon becomes the story of how Ellen Brody got her groove back. So yeah, the question I'm sure that most people thought when Jaws the Revenge hit theaters was, who wants to see an Ellen Brody starring bereavement-powered psychic shark revenge film? Well, the answer is Lorraine Gary and her husband Sid Sheinberg. still the powerhouse executive and CEO of Universal Pictures at this time. Steinberg essentially strong-armed the film into existence, hiring Joseph Sargent, who had worked with Gary on the TV movie The Marcus Nelson Murders, to direct, and having screenwriter Michael de Guzman write a draft for the film in 5 weeks' time. With the script barely completed before filming began, as Universal, in the midst of a downturn, was desperate for a hit in the middle of summer 1987. The film that was made was absolutely not what the studio needed. You know those types of movies that look good on paper but can't really be turned into a well-made film? Or the movies that seem like a disaster in production but turn out great? Well, Jaws the Revenge is neither of those. It's a movie that was a bad idea from the start, simply filmed to satisfy the egos and demands of stars and studio. And you can tell that there's really nothing left for this film after 3 movies have picked this plot clean. So instead of a well-crafted piece of horror or an enjoyable drama, we have a truly bug-nuts film filled with psychic visions, a roaring shark that explodes from being stabbed like Ursula, Mario Van Peebles with a horrendous Jamaican accent, who is totally fine after being bloodily chomped to bits, and a tone that drunkenly lurches between heart-wrenching sorrow, complete with flashbacks to the original to remind us that this guy used to be a little boy before he was sharked to death, and the feel-good hit of the summer. Some of that is the result of reshoots that made the ending more, memorable, but this entire film is a mess. Also, would you believe the original script wanted Roy Scheider to come back and be killed by the shark in the first scene? When he refused, the film was changed to say he died of a heart attack due to his fear of the ocean.
Can't believe that voodoo. Sharks don't commit murder, they don't pick out a person.
It picked out Sean. It killed your father.
Dad died from a heart attack.
He died from fear. The fear of it killed him.
Mom, listen to me.
The man killed 2 enormous sharks on his own. What's to be afraid of? He's basically Aquaman now. Oh god, I'm getting off track. Anyway, Jaws the Revenge was released on July 17th, 1987, and made $51.9 million against its $23 million budget. Definitely not the new blockbuster Universal was hoping for, but honestly, a shockingly large amount for being the last festering remnants of a franchise well past its expiration date. And immediately upon release, the film was ridiculed for being embarrassing trash, with ending reshoots causing Michael Caine to miss accepting his Best Supporting Actor for Hannah and Her Sisters. Caine would later say about the film, "I have never seen it, but by all accounts, it is terrible. However, I have seen the house that it built, and it is terrific." So, with the movie this bad and widely ridiculed, it's no surprise that Jaws the Revenge was the end of this franchise. No one is dumb enough to want to actually remake Spielberg's original film, and no one really wants to make a legacy sequel after all these additional movies kind of ended this franchise definitively. But what I would say is the true lasting legacy of Jaws is the endless wave of shark films in the decades since, and the public's real-world fears of sharks. The endless wave of Jaws clones started just a few years after Spielberg's film, hoping to cash in on its success and replicable formula with films like Mako, The Jaws of Death in 1976, Orca in 1977, and Piranha in 1978. Not all of these are straight rip-offs. Orca is a very strange movie that essentially does Jaws the Revenge before Jaws the Revenge, with a stronger bent toward oceanic conservation, while Piranha is just trying to be wild and fun. As for the most insane Jaws ripoff, my vote goes to 1995's Cruel Jaws. Directed by schlockmaster Bruno Mattei and using Italy's very loose copyright rules for marketing as a Jaws sequel. It has very terrible effects, copious amounts of reused footage from Jaws, and snippets of the Star Wars score for some reason. And while there were plenty of CB-style films in the immediate aftermath of Jaws, a clone doesn't need to be set on the water to copy the film. Grizzly, alligator, crocodile, squirm, dogs, razorback, Kingdom of the Spiders, and a whole lot more are all about a single or a small group of animals attacking and disrupting a community and the group of heroes that try to stop them. Really, the massive amount of Jaws clones that completely replace the animal, location, and atmosphere, but still retain the essence and structure of the original, illustrate what the central fear of all these films are. That man is not truly at the top of the food chain, and that the structures and safeguards of our society aren't enough to keep nature from reasserting its dominance at any moment. Jaws is so fantastic because while it's a creature feature like the rest of these, it's so well done and has so many other elements to its story that those fears are layered deeper into it. The clones are often just people getting chomped and clawed, so the base fears are a lot easier to tap into. And really, the Jaws clones have never slowed down in the half-century of movies since. They've just morphed and become more complicated or bigger scale. It's really why you can't make just another official Jaws movie. The late 90s had Anaconda, Deep Blue Sea, and Lake Placid, which all really push the man versus big animal concept to its extremes, and are all pretty fun because they're ridiculous. 47 Meters Down and The Shallows are a stripped-down and simplified story of woman versus shark. The Meg is What If Jaws, but even bigger. The modern Jaws clones are a lot more similar to the original because it's been so long since the last film. Just add an extra concept to the story and you can satisfy audiences that want Jaws again without feeling like it's a straight copy. And that speaks to the ongoing public fear of sharks that's become the other lasting legacy of Benchley's novel. There's always been a certain fear of sharks and sea creatures for as long as humans have told stories of the ocean, and the desire to exploit and conquer the sea is centuries old, with Herman Melville's Moby Dick in 1851 being the first modern documentation of commercial whaling. But it was Jaws that really sparked today's fear of the shark. Like I said earlier, Benchley's novel paints the great white as more of a true animal hunting on instinct, while the films lean more and more into painting it as a vicious monster. And in response, public fear of sharks grew and grew, with Jaws' portrayal of the rogue man-eating shark often being synonymous with great whites and more. However, according to Field & Stream, there is an average of only 70 shark attacks worldwide every year, with the vast majority being minor or non-fatal. But combine widespread fear of sharks with overfishing, pollution, unsafe fishing practices, and purposeful hunting of a creature that modern media has portrayed as an unstoppable monster for trophies and food, and in the decades since, the great white population has continued to decrease, with fewer than 5,000 in existence today. In response, both Speilberg and Benchley regretted the negative impact of Jaws on sharks, with Benchley in particular dedicating the last several decades of his life to shark education and conservation, moving away from writing fiction and authoring several non-fiction novels focused on shark education. What I now know, which wasn't known when I wrote Jaws, is that there is no such thing as a rogue shark which develops a taste for human flesh, said Benchley. No one appreciates how vulnerable they are to destruction. Peter Benchley would pass away in 2006 at the age of 65. But his legacy through Jaws lives on today. A story that speaks to our innate connection to and fear of the power of the natural world. And as I do with every retrospective, here's my ranking of every Jaws film, from worst to best. At 4, Jaws 3D. I've said this before in other videos, but good or bad, the worst thing that a movie can be is boring. These are supposed to be forms of entertainment after all, and I really think that Jaws 3D is incredibly boring. It has nothing story, it has really bland characters, and all of the shark attacks are really poorly done. Throw in the 3D, which causes all of these moments to slow down to just a crawl, so we can see a set of jaws or a shark or a fish just kind of slowly move to the camera over the course of like 30 seconds or a minute, and you have a film that crawls to its end. There's nothing interesting here, it's not rewatchable, and it's extremely forgettable. In fact, you kind of forget about what's happening in this plot or who these characters are in the middle of watching this movie, and so I have no problem with ranking Jaws 3D as the absolute worst Jaws movie. At 3, Jaws the Revenge. This is a completely insane movie, but what really struck me on the rewatch this time, and oh my gosh, I've rewatched this movie way too much, is that the first act is essentially a really heavy melodrama, and it's filled with Ellen Brody's emotional devastation over losing so much of her family, which is really not a good time, and is a lot darker than what you might expect from Jaws the Revenge and everything that comes afterward. After that first act, you get a really weird and silly and hyper-exaggerated film. You know, psychic connections to the shark, exploding sharks, people being picked off of banana boats or swallowed whole and then fine. It is incredibly insane. It is a massive gear shift from that first act to the rest of the film, and I'm sure they were trying to give it some emotional weight, which obviously doesn't work. But I would say there are several things about Jaws the Revenge that I love in most every movie. Of course, a Christmas setting, a tropical setting, a Christmas tropical setting, elderly romance, fighting sharks, exploding sharks, sharks that roar, and really bad decisions behind the steering wheel of a plane, along with children on board, which you really shouldn't do at all, even if you're a very experienced flyer. All of that together means that Jaws the Revenge is a completely incomprehensible film that you would think, how did anyone ever greenlight this to be made? In fact, shortly after rewatching this film for this review, I summed up the plot for my mom, and she did not believe me at all that this was an actual movie and that I wasn't just making it up. I mean, she is, after all, a penguin that lives in a sewer, but you would think that she would believe her son, and I really had a hard time convincing her. At 2, Jaws 2. This is a return to Jaws and doing the exact same plot again, but bland. And in a different world, this is exactly what the original film would have been if it didn't have all of the incredible talent behind the camera and in front of it. And you would think that most other movies about sharks would kind of just be like this. Totally fine, gives you what you want, but nothing exceptional, and it wouldn't have the legacy that the original film ended up having. Really, this is just the plot of the original Jaws done again, but with less frills, less characters, a smaller setting, and throwing in some teens that Brody is related to, so you can have some extra personal drama, and then you just run the same points again. It's totally fine, and obviously, like I said, this is better than 3 and 4, but it is really skippable if you want to see this franchise for all the wild extremes that it goes to, because once you've seen Jaws, you've seen everything that Jaws 2 does. And at number 1, the original Jaws. How could it really be anything else, right? The original Jaws isn't just so much better than every other film in the franchise, and basically any other shark movie that's ever been made, but I really do think that Spielberg's original film is one of the greatest movies of all time. It has everything you could possibly want out of a summer blockbuster. It has incredible action, it's scary, the effects, although limited, are really, really wonderful for what they're trying to accomplish here. The direction is impeccable. Spielberg came out of the womb a perfect director. And you have these incredible characters from your main cast to even the small characters that make up the rest of Amity Island as these really rich and complex individuals that all collide in different ways because of this shark attack. I absolutely love our main characters as well, and what I think is so endlessly fascinating about Jaws is that it has 3 really distinct acts, and there is an incredibly hard gear shift between the end of Act 2 and the end of Act 3 as we go on this massive high seas adventure that really zeroes in on Brody, Quint, and Hooper. And together they make a really interesting trio that you love to see bounce off one another. All the while you are enjoying yourself incredibly, but are also scared whenever the shark is nearby and is about to attack. It has this incredible set of stakes that become more and more personal because it's not just affecting the island of Amity, but it is affecting all of our main characters in very interesting and tragic ways. And it is, strangely, a feel-good time as well. You know, there are people that debate whether Jaws is a horror film or not, but I 100% believe that Jaws is a horror film. It's just many more things as well. And when it shifts gears to being something other than that straight horror, it really does live into being a drama, a comedy, an adventure, and it is all of those things at once. And it makes all of those elements so much richer. So it's really, really impossible for me to say that anything could ever really top Jaws when it comes to, you know, a shark movie or a summer blockbuster, right? Or this very specific style and approach that Spielberg has. And Spielberg has had many, many amazing movies, but I think that Jaws is still probably my favorite movie that Spielberg's ever done. It's really hard to top, even with an amazing filmography like his. And there's a reason why, after 50 years, Jaws has this wonderful legacy that comes around every year that is endlessly rewatchable and that I am still incredibly enthralled with every time I watch it. I never get sick of this film. It is easily one of the best movies ever made. Now, 50 years removed from Jaws and almost 40 years since its last sequel, it's safe to say that this franchise is officially finished. But the love for Spielberg and Benchley's story, and its continued influence on both fans and filmmakers alike half a century later, is proof that the film will never truly lose its power. And as long as we never feel truly safe to go back in the water, Jaws will stay a beloved source of fear and fascination. Thanks for watching today's video and the finale of this year's Summerween celebration. And I can think of no better way of ending this season than a Jaws retrospective. Close to the start of my channel, I did a video on Jaws. But I think that I've grown a lot in the time since, and I never really talked about the sequels. So with the 50th anniversary coming up, I knew it was time to finally go back to Jaws. And I hope that you've enjoyed this return journey and my much larger scope with this retrospective. Prior to making this video, I had never read Benchley's novel. And while I don't think that it's all that great, I'm glad that I finally did. Reading it gave me a much better understanding of this story and the ways that the film improved it, and a better understanding of where all the sequels went wrong, because they all went wrong in some way. Jaws is one of those franchises that started with a nearly perfect film and could never really live up to it, but after a while got so bad that there was absolutely no comparison. Watching them for this retrospective is a little torturous, but also kind of fun in a really dumb way. And really, I do think that Jaws 3D is the absolute worst of the bunch. I know that Jaws the Revenge is widely ridiculed, and rightfully so, but it is just so much more entertaining than Jaws 3D, which is just so boring and so bad. Looking back on Jaws, I am a little surprised that there's never been a Jaws 5 or a Jaws Legacy sequel or a Jaws reboot, but it's been so long and the original is such a hallowed text that I think by this point it's never gonna happen. Or at least it's not gonna happen for another 20 years. And when it does, it's gonna have a lot to live up to. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of the Jaws movies, how you'd rank them, and your other favorite shark movies outside of Jaws. Because there are so many. I briefly scratched the surface, and there are hundreds and hundreds of more shark movies. As always, a huge thank you to my members and patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive member and patron only reviews, with this Summerween's exclusive review being Shaun of the Dead. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and not being too afraid to go back in the water.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.